So here we are at rotations part 2, which is the last lesson in unit 6, which has had a lot of geometry. And so we're talking today about how to identify rotations easier than actually rotating the page. So rotating the page is how rotations were first done until we noticed that there were some patterns. So today we're looking at and for those patterns. So we have here a shape called ABCDE, and then we have here the image A prime, B prime, C prime, D prime, E prime. So things that I am noticing about the coordinates or about the shape in general, it appears that we have rotated it into the next quadrant, which would be 90 degrees clockwise. And what's interesting is you don't necessarily have to think of it as 90 degrees clockwise. You could also think of it as 90, 180, 270. If you rotate counterclockwise, it is the same as rotating 270 counterclockwise. So this new shape has coordinates of 5, 3, 5, 1, and so on. So if we look at the original, negative 3, 5 became the image 5, 3. So negative 3, 5 became 5, positive 3. So what is happening here? What are the patterns that we are finding? First of all, you will notice that this number moved to the second spot. So the x coordinate became the y coordinate, and it became its opposite. So the negative 3 became a positive 3, and it moved from the x spot to the y spot. You will also notice that the y coordinate moved to the x coordinate, but did not become its opposite. And we'd want to see if this happened on all of them. So for example, the negative 1, 5, if it followed that pattern, the negative 1 should have moved to the second spot and become its opposite, positive 1. And the positive 5 should have moved to the first spot, positive 5, and we get 5, 1. And that is exactly what happened. So what are we noticing about the coordinates of the image compared to the original? So we can say first that the x coordinate becomes the opposite and moves to the y coordinate, right? It moved from the x spot to the y spot and became its opposite. We can also say that we noticed that the y coordinate becomes the x coordinate. And it didn't switch, right? The 5 became a 5. It didn't switch to its opposite. Other things that are happening here, we can describe using the coordinate notation. So the original point, which we were saying was xy, becomes the image point. So how do we describe that? The number that was x moves to the second spot. So the x coordinate moves to the second spot and becomes its opposite. The y coordinate, which was in the second spot, becomes the first spot and does not become its opposite. So this is a pattern that works if you are either calling it a 90 degree clockwise or 270 degree counterclockwise. This will work for any shape, and you can rotate individual points this way. So for example, if you had, like, let's say the point 7, negative 2, it could become the image point. The 7 would move to the second spot and become its opposite, negative 7. And the negative 2 would move to the front spot where the x is and stay a negative 2. I don't know. I find this fascinating. It is a little tricky, and it is something that has to be memorized if you're going to use this strategy instead of rotating the paper. What if the figure was rotated 90 degrees clockwise? So this is a set of coordinates for an image after the original has been rotated 90 degrees clockwise. So here we go. So this one is 90 degrees clockwise. The first one, oh, I'm sorry, counterclockwise. I'm saying clockwise out loud, and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. So this one, we're going to go 90 degrees counterclockwise. So this is the opposite of the first example. So the original coordinate is 5, 3. The image becomes negative 3, 5. All right, so let's look at what that means. The original is 5, 3, but it becomes negative 3, 5. So if we look for the same pattern, you will notice that the X5 just becomes the Y5. It just moves. But the Y3 becomes the opposite and moves into the X spot. So this reads a little bit differently than the first one. So we would say on this one, the original point XY becomes the image if the X just moves to the back. The Y moves to the front and becomes the opposite. Notice very similar to the first one, but because one is rotating 90 degrees clockwise and one is rotating 90 degrees counterclockwise, slight difference. This one, the Y coordinate becomes the opposite. Up here, it was the X coordinate that became its opposite. And again, this is something that gets memorized. It's not something that you want to sit and play around with when you're taking a quiz or a test. You would want to sit down and say, I know these facts. I know how this works. On the first day, we talked about a 180-degree rotation, that both things just become their opposites. The 90-degree clockwise was our first example at the top, where the X and the Y switch spots. But when the X moves, it becomes its opposite. And if it's 90-degree counterclockwise, which is the same as 270 degrees clockwise, then the X and Y switch spots, but the Y becomes its opposite. And I don't have any super great mnemonic tricks for this. The 180, most kids find very easy. You're like, okay, I'm basically moving to the opposite part of the quadrants, so I'm just going to make everything its opposite. These two, people always remember that the X and Y switch spots. If it's clockwise, the X switches to its opposite. If it's counterclockwise, the Y switches to its opposite. And it's just a matter of memorizing.